Hi everyone. Today I'm using saran wrap or cling film to do some rock texture in this painting. This is a 9 by 12 block of hot press paper, and I have my board on a wee bit of a tilt. Now the long version of this video is over on Patreon, so you can check that out over there. So to get going on these rocks, I'm using some really wet mix of yellow ochre. I got some burnt sienna, some sepia, and throwing in some Payne's gray and purple. And I'm just going to get through all the colors in and define where I want my rocks to be. Tilt the board a wee bit, and then here comes the saran wrap. So I'm just going to smush that into the area. Make sure it's all pressed down, and then I'm going to leave that for 15 minutes. And there are my rocks. To finish the hill in the foreground, I'm going to add a grassy texture. So I'm going to wet that entire area with, that's a mix of cadmium yellow and yellow ochre. And what I want to do is I'm suggesting that the light is coming from the upper left, so I want to keep a bit of a bright spot and keep that yellow look at the very top of the hill. So now with all that all nice and wet, I'm just going to drop in a whole bunch of greens. So I've got some sap green, bit of olive green, and even throwing in some indigo to darken up the immediate foreground. I'm going to do the same approach as I did with the rock. So what I'm doing is just filling the area with a bunch of paint. And I thought I'd give the saran wrap or cling film a bit of a go on the grass to see if I get a cool texture out of that. And while that's drying, my 15 minutes, I'm adding some shadow to the rocky area there and starting to define my rocks. So I'm just using like a light gray mix or something like that to throw in some shadows and define where the rocks are. And there, I lifted my saran wrap and got some texture, not sure about it. But I think I can still work with it. And the dog has just joined us. So here I mentioned that my light is coming from the left, so I'm just adding a bit more yellow up there, and I just buffed out some of the rocks to give them a bit of a highlight. So with the grassy area dry, I can now go in with a glaze more or less and just put some more greens on top. I'm using my fan brush there to give it a bit more texture. And now it's time to get the pen out. That is Salami Safari Extra Fine. And I'm just going to further define where the rocks are. And once I know where my rocks are, I can enhance the shadows and darken up some of the areas, especially in the immediate foreground. Now, just beyond the hill, I have a little stand of trees, so I'm going in with a wet mix of some yellows and then dropping in a bit of green and a wee bit of blue just to push them back into the distance. I'm not putting a lot of effort into the sky. It's just a wet on dry approach. So I just threw some raw sienna in for the immediate horizon and just a bit of cobalt blue. Very pale sky in this case. I wanted the emphasis to be on the rocks in the foreground. And there, just adding a bit of shadow to the outhouse and a bit of dirt to the base of it. For my trees, just a wet and wet mix. That's my small mop brush. Just dropping in some yellows to create the tree, the foliage, the textures. And while it's wet, just dropping some greens in, all wet and wet. And I was just using my rigger brush to define some of the smaller branches. And a pinch of salt to give the tree even more texture. Now this larger tree over on the left, exact same approach, all wet and wet. just fooling around with colors. I have a little deck or balcony sticking out over the rocks, looking off into the distance using the rigger brush for the structure underneath. And here I've introduced the Rotring Isograph pen to do some really fine line work, and that is a 0.25. And the ink I'm using in this case is a Diatramentis document ink, which of course is waterproof. Again, this place is an introvert's paradise. Notice there's only one chair on the deck. And now I'm just adding a wee balcony over on the right-hand side. I have a brick chimney in this case, so that's just a mix of burnt sienna, bit of red in there, and then darkening it up with some sepia. It's a very small area, but again, all wet and wet. There I get the pen out and further define some of the stuff over on the right. Really light touch around the foliage. I don't want to darken the lines too much, so I'm more or less just scratching the surface with my pen to create the outline on the trees. And now for the roof, that's I think that's about a 1/2 inch flat brush I got going there, and that is yellow ochre. I don't want to put too much detail into the roof, so I'm just going wet and wet. And just let it dry, and I don't think I'm going to ink over that. I want to keep it rather plain so your eye is kind of drawn to the front of the house where the rocks are. The little addition on the side there is a wooden structure, so I'm going with some raw sienna, some burnt sienna, bit of sepia, and a wee bit of purple, all wet and wet. Now for the main part of the house, I'm going with it's a tall stone structure, and I've mixed up a batch of ultramarine with some purple and Payne's gray. And what I'm going to do is, I was going to use the saran wrap or cling film on that, but opted just to paint it in. So it's all wet and wet. I'm just dropping a bunch of colors in, including burnt sienna, purple, Payne's gray, all that stuff, just going in wet and wet. This is a hot press paper, so you can more or less just move the paint around until you get the look you like. Now, I was in a rush, so I hit it with the dryer just so I can get around to inking. And once again, I'm using the Lamy Safari pen to do the bulk of the inking and define where the stones are on that structure. While I'm inking, I probably should mention that be awesome if you want to like and subscribe to this. Helps me out, and I really do appreciate the feedback and the nice comments I'm getting. So here I'm just grabbing some grays and blues and adding some shadow to the underside of some of those stones, just to give the building a bit of depth. And speaking of shadows, I'm just going to drop a nice thick shadow in under that rather large roof. And as I mentioned, my light is coming from the left, so the dormer is going to throw a shadow over to the right. Now my eaves trough and downspout, that's all a hooker's green mixed in with a bit of burnt sienna for the rusty bits. Again, small area, but all wet in wet. And there I have to paint the thing sticking out of the roof, little flower pot over on the deck. And then we get around to the final little bits of inking. And a nice welcoming yellow front door. A bit weathered, so I put in wet and wet, started out with a yellow and just mopped out a bit and added a bit of dirt to the base of it. And that should about do it. Get the signature on it, get the tape off it, and let's have a look. And there it is. Thanks for dropping by, and we'll see you again soon. Oh, and by the way, if you want a print of this or other prints, there's where you can find them over on Etsy. Much appreciated. See you later.